The next generation of gaming consoles from both Sony and Microsoft have come out a couple months ago as of the posting of this video, and launch-wise, it doesn't seem like there's that much crazy out of the ordinary stuff for, you know, kind of just console launch stuff in general. There's been weird issues like game crashes and save data corruption, but, you know, this isn't that crazy. There's always lemons at every console launch, and usually they iron out a lot of these sort of weird early issues by like a year in. However, there has been one aspect of this console launch that has been kind of an absolute disaster when it comes to support. Now, granted, it's a very minor thing in the grand scheme, considering that it doesn't light your console on fire or deletes your saves or just doesn't boot. But I still think that this aspect of both machines and just consumer electronics in general kind of shows that nobody was really prepared for these consoles to come out. And that is HDMI 2.1 support. For those not in the loop, HDMI 2.1 is the newest specification of HDMI, requiring not only new connectors on your source devices and, you know, the hardware that goes along with that, but also brand new higher transfer speed cables. Yeah, but every new HDMI standard has bandwidth increases. So what makes HDMI 2.1 particularly special, and why am I making a video on it? Well, HDMI 2.1 is actually really particularly targeted towards the gaming audience. That the HDMI form really took into consideration gamers when making it and have built in a lot of stuff into the spec that is dedicated for giving the best gaming experience possible. Now, auto low latency mode does kind of what it sounds like. It sends a signal from the source device to your display and says, hey, go to your lowest lag state and, you know, turn that on when I am outputting something. So that way I can have, you know, whatever person is playing it to have the best experience. And the display's like, okay. And so you don't have to really fiddle around with menus or look up on message boards how to like optimally like get it to the lowest lag state. And the other big one is variable refresh rate. And it's kind of harder to explain what this does, but kind of the idea of it is that if you have a game that isn't quite at like a locked interval of like frame rate, like a 30 or 60 or 120 or whatever that matches your panel's refresh rate, that it'll kind of make the gameplay experience smoother, that it'll stop the screen tears that you'll have if like you're playing a game and like the frame rate's hovering in the 50s. Like it'll make sure that that is all smoother. Variable refresh rate has been a thing on like PC displays for like 5 or 6 years now, but the problem was that AMD and Nvidia had their own different implementations of it, and there wasn't really cross-compatibility between the two until very recently. So the fact that HDMI just kind of includes it as like a baseline standard rather than having to worry about, you know, using AMD's version or Nvidia's version is like really, really nice. Now, HDMI 2.1 isn't gonna necessarily solve every particular issue when it comes to displays, but it is a step in the right direction of kind of rectifying a lot of the problems that the shift from CRT to LCDs have had for gaming, and that how nobody has particularly cared about fixing it until like now. But talking about actually like displays and the manufacturers and all the stuff that they messed up could be a whole other video in of itself. I just want to talk right now about the Series X and the PS5 and their weirdly bungled HDMI support. Now let's start with kind of a nitpick for both devices in that both of them do not support the full 48 gigabits per second specification for 2.1. Now this isn't an entirely huge deal because a lot of 4K TVs with 2.1 limit their ports to 40 gigabits per second anyways. The intended use case of both of these consoles is 4K gaming, and even at 40 gigabits per second, you can still do 4K, 120, no chroma subsampling, HDR, a billion audio channels. Like, for the vast majority of people who are going to be playing on these devices, like even for someone with like a nice high-end OLED, like you're going to be fine with only 40 gigabits per second. But the thing is, though, is that Sony and Microsoft advertise the consoles as being 8K capable. And the problem with that is that you need the full 48 gigabits per second to reach 8K 60 FPS. Now, I don't think any games are probably going to be playing on either of those consoles at that resolution and refresh rate. I mean, maybe a couple of indie games, maybe some retro game collections. When you advertise 8K compatibility, but then you gimp the HDMI port to not be able to fully support the thing that you fucking mentioned on the box, like, come on, guys. Now, this is where the two consoles kind of diverge in their capability of supporting the full spec. And the Series X is way better at doing this. Hell, it even supports AMD FreeSync, which I don't know if anybody was asking for FreeSync when it first popped up with the One X like 4 years ago. But hey, you know what? That's cool. That's a cool bonus. But the PlayStation 5 is like such a disaster with its HDMI port. I can't believe that it comes from the same hardware company that made the PlayStation 4. You know, the console that sold 100 million plus units, that Mark Cerny had the foresight to put HDR compatibility in the hardware before it officially became a thing in like 2016. First of all, the PS5's HDMI port seems to be even more gimped than the Series X. Some independent testing that I've seen online puts it like at lowest at 32 gigabytes per second. So that means that you're gonna have to compromise somewhere when it comes to trying to get the most out of your PlayStation 5. Now, obviously, I think there's gonna be very few games that are gonna run at like 4K 120 hertz. But like, it just seems kind of weird to me that if you want to run a game at that high a res and that frame rate, that you're gonna have to be compromising on like color space. Like, it just kind of seems like a crowbar to the leg. Like, it just seems like unnecessary. The worst thing about it is that nobody's quite sure why it's 32 gigabytes per second. Some people speculate that it's a firmware lock and that Sony will eventually, when it patches in some of the stuff I'll talk about later, that it'll unlock the HDMI port to full 40 gigabits per second. But then other people are like, hey, maybe this might be like a hardware issue. Maybe this port can't support any faster than 32 gigs. That they'd have to redesign the system to make the HDMI port be able to support faster speeds than 32 gigabytes per second. Secondly, the PS5 does not support VRR at all. No, I don't mean like, oh, it just has the basic HDMI one and it's missing FreeSync compared to Xbox. No. It doesn't have any sort of variable refresh rate, anything. I can't believe that in 2020, Sony put like greater than 60 hertz refresh rate capability on the PS5, and they didn't put VRR in there specifically for the high refresh rate. It's even missing auto low latency mode, which is like, what? Like, you'd think that'd be like the easiest thing to implement out of like all these missing features, but I guess it's too much effort for Sony. These two features are not just nice to have things like 4K. Like, these are actually things that will affect your gameplay. These are things that will affect your ability to play games on the PlayStation 5. Like, I don't get why these things are missing. Let's use the example game of Devil May Cry 5 to show you how the lack of these features is really annoying. Because one, it's a high-octane, fast-paced action game where split-second reactions are really important. And two, it just has a lot of graphical settings options and frame rate settings options, so you can kind of tailor the experience to how you want. And so missing some of these features can be shown with this game. Now, DMC5 has a 120 FPS mode on both the Series X and the PS5. And Series X, you play at 120 FPS with DMC5, like, you're good to go. Like, VRR's got your back. Like, the game's gonna be smoother. And, you know, you have auto low latency mode, so you can fully take advantage of that, you know, close to 120 hertz refresh rate when you're trying to beat up on enemies and stuff. PlayStation 5 tells you to go fuck yourself. Like, oh, you try to play this game at 120 FPS? Like, Lamau, good fucking luck, because there's no VRR, and auto low latency mode doesn't trigger, so you know, you might be dying to shit that you might not if you don't know what your TV settings are to turn all that stuff off. Now, you might be sitting here and thinking like, wow, you're complaining a lot about all this stuff, but like, why do I care? Like, you might have a 4K TV, but it's not an HDMI 2.1 one because, well, HDMI 2.1 displays are like $800 or more, and most people don't spend $1,000 on a TV. And you know what, that's a fair point, but there's one more curveball about the PS5 that does actually affect the vast majority of people that own 4K TVs right now. The PS5 cannot output 1440p. Now, this might sound kind of like a weird complaint. It's like, well, 1440p is not a TV resolution, it's more a monitor resolution, so everybody with 1440p displays, you know, kind of loses out. And like, yeah, on paper, it doesn't sound that bad. But here's the problem. Again, let's go back to DMC5 for a real example. Let's say I'm playing Devil May Cry 5 on my PS5 that I don't own right now. That I want to make a sick gameplay compilation. I've been practicing my skills and my combos, and I want to make myself look cool. So I want to record the game running at like 120 FPS so I can slow it down for some cool shots in like slow-mo or whatever. And so I decide, okay, I'm going to plug my PS5 into my capture card because it does have high frame rate support. But since my AverMedia Live Gamer 4K capture card only supports HDMI 2.0, that means it can support 1440p at 120 FPS. Now, normally, this would not be a big deal because from, again, Digital Foundry, they estimate that DMC5 SC at 120 FPS on Series X and PS5 runs around like 1600p. So I'll take a little bit of loss in resolution in order for me to get that sick 120 FPS at the max res my capture card's capable of. But the problem is that the PS5 can't output 1440p. So what it does normally is, if you have a 2.1 device, it goes up to upscaled 4K and 120 FPS, which would be fine if we had any devices that properly supported HDMI 2.1. There are no capture cards that support it right now. So then the PS5 goes all the way down to 1080p 120 FPS because it can't go between 4K and 1080. It has to go all the way down to 1080 in order to output 120 FPS. Even though the HDMI 2.0 specification and many TVs that support HDMI 2.0 can do 1440p, 120 FPS with absolutely zero bandwidth problems, the PS5 just won't comply. I know I've seen Sony executives be like, oh, if you want 1440p on the PS5, ask for it, but like, did they really not think that no one wanted 1440p in the PS5? That somehow Xbox knew to put 1440p in the Series X, but Sony was dumb enough to not put it in. Like, really? Anyways, that's it. I'm kind of done talking about this. I've been talking like long enough. So anyways, guys, that's it, and have a good day.